I never thought I'd be the guy eavesdropping on his own wife, but there I was, straining to catch snippets of Emily's hushed phone conversations. It started small, you know? A text here, a whisper there, just enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was a Thursday night. I remember clearly. Emily thought I was asleep, but how could I? My mind was racing, replaying the moments she'd been acting off. She was in the living room, her fingers dancing over her phones during a solo. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel the secrecy in the air. It was thick, almost suffocating. A week later, the plot thickened. She was on a call, voice low, words flowing out in a careful trickle. I was in the hallway, just out of sight. I can't talk now. He's here, she whispered, sending a chill down my spine. Who was she talking to? Why the secrecy? It was like living in a bad spy movie. I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted her the next day, my voice more of a plea than an accusation. Emily, is everything okay? You've been different. Her eyes darted away before meeting mine, a rehearsed smile plastering her face. It's just work stress, John. You know how it gets. But the unease in her voice, the slight tremor, told a different story. I wanted to believe her. God, I did. But doubt is like a seed. Once planted, it grows, creeping into every crevice of your mind. Emily's late-night texts, her hushed calls, they were watering that seed, and I was helpless to stop it. There was no going back now. I was caught in the web of suspicion, every action of Emily scrutinized under the lens of my doubts. The woman I loved, the woman I trusted, had become a stranger, and I was left grappling with the shadows of uncertainty. It was just the beginning, the first chapter of a story I never wanted to be a part of. But there it was, unraveling before me, one suspicion at a time. Man, if you told me a year ago I'd be rummaging through Emily's purse, I'd have laughed in your face. But there I was, heart pounding, hands shaky. It was supposed to be innocent, just looking for her phone to check the weather. But what I found wasn't a phone. It was a crumpled receipt from the Grandview Hotel, dated just last week. Room service, and a bottle of champagne. My mind raced. She told me she was with her sister that night. I needed to talk to someone, get this heavy load off my chest. So, I called Mike, my buddy since college. We met at our usual spot, a dingy little bar downtown. Mike, I think Emily's seeing someone else, I blurted out, not even waiting for him to sit down. He looked at me, his face a mix of shock and concern. John, are you sure? Maybe it's a misunderstanding, but the look in my eyes told him everything. Okay, man, what do you want to do? I had already made up my mind. I needed to know the truth. That evening, I told Emily I was working late, a lie to uncover another. I parked my car down the street, my heart a ticking time bomb. There she was, stepping out, looking around nervously before heading down the street. I followed at a distance, every step echoing in my head. She led me to a quaint Italian restaurant. I watched from afar as she met with a guy tall, dark-haired, definitely not her sister. They seemed close, too close. My stomach churned as they laughed, his hand touching hers across the table. It was like watching a movie, except I was the guy who didn't see the plot twist coming. The evening dragged on, each minute a dagger in my heart. Finally, they left, heading in opposite directions. I drove home, a storm brewing inside me. The evidence was right there. Yet part of me still hoped it was all a big misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew. I just didn't want to face it yet. That night, as Emily slipped into bed, whispering a tired, I love you, I felt a distance wider than any ocean. The truth was lurking in the shadows, waiting to shatter everything. And I was just not ready to confront it yet. You know that feeling when your world flips upside down? Yeah, I got a first-hand experience of that. It was a Tuesday, a nothing special kind of day, or so I thought. I was walking past this cafe, the one Emily loves for their artisanal coffee, and there she was, sitting by the window. Not alone, though. With her was this guy, someone I'd never seen before. I should have walked away, I guess, but I couldn't. It was like my feet had a mind of their own. So, I stood there, outside, looking in. They were laughing, her hand casually touching his. It was like a punch to the gut. I mean, we had our issues, but this? I never saw it coming. I stumbled away, each step heavier than the last. The images from the cafe played on a loop in my head. Emily, my Emily, with another guy. It felt unreal, like a bad dream. But the ache in my heart, that was as real as it gets. The rest of the day was a blur. I tried to make sense of it all, but nothing added up. By the time I got home, I was a mess, a whirlwind of hurt and anger. Emily was there, cooking dinner, acting like everything was normal. I couldn't take it. Who is he, Emily? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She froze, spoon midair. The look on her face said it all, even before she spoke. John, I can explain. But what followed wasn't an explanation, not really. It was a confession. She met him a few months back. Things got out of hand. She never meant to hurt me. I listened, or at least I tried to. But her words were muffled by the sound of my breaking heart. Betrayal is a strange thing. It doesn't just hurt, it hollows you out, leaves you empty. We talked for hours, or maybe it was minutes. Tom didn't make sense anymore. She cried, said she was sorry, that it was a mistake. Part of me wanted to scream, to lash out, but I just sat there, numb. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. My mind was a battlefield, love and hurt colliding. I thought I knew Emily, thought our love was solid. But as I lay there, next to her yet miles apart, I realized I was living a lie. The truth? It was as bitter as it gets, and I was just starting to taste it. The days after the confession were like walking through a fog. Emily, she was trying hard, you know. Her eyes were constantly filled with this plea for forgiveness. She'd say things like, John, I'll do anything to fix this. And a part of me, a big part, wanted to believe her, to wipe the slate clean. So, we made this pact, a sort of last-ditch effort to salvage what was left of us. She cut all ties with the guy, and I tried to bury the hurt. We started going to this marriage counselor, Dr. Lewis. The office was this cozy little room, filled with books and those cliché motivational posters. Dr. Lewis was okay, I guess. He had this calm way of talking, like every word was measured. Communication is key, he'd say. And we'd talk, Emily and I, about everything. The affair, our feelings, the distance that had crept into our marriage. For a while, it seemed to work. We'd have these moments, brief flashes where it felt like the old times. Emily would laugh at my jokes, and I'd catch myself looking at her, really looking, and seeing the woman I fell in love with. But, trust is a fragile thing. Once it's broken, it's like trying to glue back a shattered vase. You can put the pieces together, but the cracks, they're always there. And no matter how much I wanted to, those cracks in our marriage, they never really went away. There were nights when I'd lie awake, watching her sleep, and my mind would race back to that cafe, to the lies. I hated it, hated that I couldn't get past it. Emily sensed it too, sometimes. She'd catch me lost in thought and her face would fall, knowing where my mind was. Despite our best efforts, something fundamental had shifted between us. The counseling, the talks, they were like band-aids on a wound too deep. I loved her, I really did. But love, it turns out, isn't always enough. Not when the trust that's supposed to hold it together is crumbling. So, there we were, stuck in this limbo. Two people, desperately trying to hold on to something that was slipping through our fingers. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted to hold on anymore. Life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. Just when I thought our marriage was hanging by a thread, Emily dropped the bombshell she was pregnant. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The betrayal, the hurt, all of it took a back seat. I remember holding her, feeling this mix of disbelief and pure joy. Maybe, just maybe, this was what we needed to turn things around. The next few months were a whirlwind. We were getting ready for the baby, painting the nursery, buying all sorts of tiny clothes. Seeing Emily with that growing bump, I felt something I hadn't in a long time hoped. I'd talk to the baby, my hands on her belly, feeling those little kicks. It was surreal, like being part of a miracle. But as the due date got closer, the old demons started creeping back in. Lying in bed at night, I'd find myself wrestling with this gnawing doubt. Whose child was it? The question haunted me, echoing in my head. I loved that baby already, but I needed to know the truth. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. A week after our baby was born, a beautiful little girl with Emily's eyes, I ordered a DNA paternity test. It felt like betrayal, doing it behind Emily's back, but the uncertainty was eating me alive. I remember the day I sent off those samples like it was yesterday. My hands were trembling, heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just a test, it was the deciding factor of my future, my family's future. The wait was agonizing. Every time I looked at Emily or held my daughter, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. The possibilities played over and over in my mind. What if she's mine? What if she's not? Then the results came. I opened the email, my breath caught in my throat, and there it was, black on white. I wasn't the father. The room spun around me, and I felt like I was falling into an abyss of hurt and betrayal all over again. I stared at my daughter, sleeping peacefully in her crib. She was innocent in all this, a tiny beacon of joy in a sea of chaos. I loved her, I realized, regardless of what that test said. But could I live with the lie? Could I be the father to a child that wasn't mine, with a woman who had broken my trust? It was the hardest decision I ever had to make. And as I sat there, holding that piece of paper that tore my world apart, I knew things were about to change. All over again. The moment I opened that envelope, it was like time stood still. Not the father. Those three words echoed in my head. A deafening silence that drowned out everything else. I sat there, the paper trembling in my hands, feeling like my entire world had just crumbled into dust. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. My daughter, the little girl I had been talking to every night, dreaming of teaching her to ride a bike, to swim. She wasn't mine. The pain was indescribable, a mix of betrayal, loss, and this deep, hollow emptiness. I must have sat there for hours, just staring at those words. It was Emily who found me, her face lighting up when she saw me holding the envelope. "So, you did the test," she said, a cautious hope in her voice. But when she saw my face, her smile faded. "John, what? What does it say?" The words came out in a whisper, my voice a stranger to my own ears. "I'm not the father, am?" Her reaction was a mix of shock, guilt, and this deep sorrow. She reached for me, but I couldn't bear her touch. Not then. The room felt stifling, the walls closing in on me. I needed answers, the whole truth. "Who is he, Emily? Who's the father?" I asked, my voice steadier now, but with a sharp edge of pain. She broke down, tears streaming down her face. "It was just one time, a mistake. His name is Mark, from work. I never meant for this to happen, John. I swear, I never meant to hurt you." Her words, her sobs, they were like a distant storm. I could see her, hear her, but I was detached, lost in a sea of betrayal. "How, Emily, how could you do this to us?" We talked, or rather, she talked, and I listened. The story of her affair unfolded, each word another weight on my already sinking heart. She spoke of loneliness, confusion, a moment of weakness. But all I could hear was the lie my life had become. After she finished, the silence was overwhelming. There was nothing left to say, no words to fix the broken pieces scattered around us. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman I had loved, trusted, and built a life with. But she was a stranger now, her face a map of roads I no longer recognized. I walked out of that room, out of the house, not knowing where I was going. I just needed to breathe, to feel something other than the crushing weight of my shattered world. The night air was cool against my skin, a stark contrast to the burning chaos inside me. As I wandered the empty streets, the reality of it all began to sink in. My marriage, my family, my future, everything had changed in the span of a single evening. And as the stars blinked down at me, indifferent to the turmoil below, I realized it was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. A chapter one never wanted, never asked for, but was thrust upon me all the same. I never thought I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office discussing how to end my marriage. Life's funny that way, throwing you into situations you swore you'd never be in. But after everything that happened, staying with Emily wasn't an option anymore. I needed to move on, for my own sanity. The lawyer's office was this cold, impersonal space, all sharp angles and sterile colors. It felt fitting, considering the nature of my visit. Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, was a no-nonsense kind of guy. He laid out the papers in front of me, his voice steady and impersonal. We'll need to decide on how to handle the custody arrangements, assets, all of that. Custody. The word hit me like a truck. My daughter, well, not biologically mine, but mine in every way that counted what would happen to her. I was torn between the hurt and the love I felt for that little girl. I want what's best for her, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Henderson nodded, jotting down notes. We went over everything, the house, our savings, the car. It felt surreal, dividing up the life we built together into columns and numbers. Each item we listed was a memory, a piece of a dream that I once thought would last a lifetime. Drafting the divorce papers was a lengthy process. Mr. Henderson explained each clause, but I was only half listening. My mind kept drifting back to Emily, to the way things used to be. But every time I thought of the good times, the betrayal sneaked in, tainting those memories. By the time I left the office, the papers were ready for Emily to sign. I felt a strange mixture of relief and profound sadness. A part of me still loved her, despite everything. But another part, the part that was hurt and betrayed, knew this was the only way forward. The drive home was a blur. I kept thinking about how to tell Emily, how to start this final, painful conversation. I knew it would break her, but the trust between us was already shattered beyond repair. When I got home, Emily was in the kitchen. She looked up, her eyes searching mine for a sign, any sign, of what was coming. I took a deep breath and handed her the envelope. I filed for divorce, I said. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. Her reaction was a mix of tears and pleas. John, we can work this out, she sobbed. But I was past the point of no return. I had given her a chance, and she had broken everything we had. I can't, I just can't do this anymore. That night, I slept in the guest room, the sound of her crying echoing through the walls. It was the hardest night of my life, letting go of the woman I loved, the life I thought we had. But sometimes, the hardest decisions are the ones that are most necessary. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I realized this was just a beginning, the beginning of a long, hard journey of healing and finding myself again. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope, the sense that maybe, just maybe, there was a light at the end of this dark tunnel. I remember staring at the divorce papers on the kitchen counter, feeling like I was standing at the edge of a cliff. Part of me wanted to just walk away, forget all about them. Emily was still Emily, the woman I'd loved for so long. It wasn't easy, trying to let go of that. But then, there were the lies, the betrayal. It felt like a wound that just wouldn't heal. Every time I looked at her, I remembered the cafe, the DNA test, all of it. It was like living with a ghost, a constant reminder of what we had lost. I was lost in these thoughts when Emily walked in. She had this hopeful look in her eyes, the same look she'd had when we first met. It tore at me, seeing her like this, knowing what I had to do. John, can we talk? She asked, her voice trembling. I just snapped. All the pain and anger that I'd been bottling up came pouring out. Talk. Now you want to talk? I picked up the papers and threw them at her, my heart pounding in my chest. Here, talk about this. The papers fluttered to the floor, and I saw the shock in her eyes. It was like I had hit her, not with my hands, but with the weight of all our broken dreams. John, please, she whispered, picking up the papers. Don't do this. We can still fix this. I wanted to believe her. God, I did. But how could we fix something so shattered? Fix this? Emily, look at us. We're a mess. You lied to me, betrayed me. How can we build anything on that? She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. I made a mistake. I'm so sorry, John. I never wanted to hurt you. Her words, they should have been a balm, but they just felt like salt on an open wound. We stood there, in the middle of our kitchen, surrounded by memories of a happier time. But it was like we were in two different worlds. I couldn't cross back into hers, not after everything. I told her then, told her it was over. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done. She begged, pleaded for another chance. But I was empty, all my forgiveness spent. I walked out of that kitchen, out of the life we had built together. The sound of her crying followed me, a haunting melody of what we used to be. I knew I was doing the right thing, but damn, it didn't make it any easier. That night, I sat alone in my living room. The silence was deafening, the absence of her presence like a void. I had won my freedom, but at what cost? I realized then that this wasn't just the end of our marriage. It was the end of a chapter in my life, a part of me that I'd never get back. And as I sat there, a single man in a house full of ghosts, I knew that the road ahead was going to be a long one. But for the first time in a long while, it was a road that I chose for myself. It was the morning after the confrontation, and the house was silent, the kind of silence that screams. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the divorce papers lying there like a final verdict. My mind was made up, but my heart? That was a different story. Packing up my life into boxes felt surreal. Each item I touched was a memory, a piece of a life that was no longer mine. The photo from our honeymoon in Greece, the coffee mug I got her for our first anniversary, they all went into the box, the tapestry of the past. I moved methodically, almost robotically. It was easier that way, not to think too much, not to let the memories seep in, but they did anyway. With every book, every piece of clothing, a part of me wanted to scream, to throw it all away and pretend none of this was happening. But it was happening. The ring on my finger felt heavy, a symbol of a promise broken. I took it off, placing it gently on the dresser. That small action felt like lifting 100-pound weight off my chest. Emily was at her sister's. I was grateful for the space. Saying goodbye would have been too hard, for both of us. I left her a note, simple words, but it was all I could muster. I wish things were different. Take care, John. What else was there to say? The car was packed, a life condensed into a few boxes and suitcases. I took one last look at the house, our house. It was just a building now, the life we built inside it already fading into memory. As I drove away, the neighborhood blurred past me. I wasn't just leaving a house. I was leaving a chapter of my life behind. It was scary, starting over. But there was also this sense of freedom, a weightlessness. I had no idea where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, the uncertainty didn't scare me. I had a lot of healing to do. The wounds were still fresh, and I knew they wouldn't heal overnight. But I also knew I'd get there, one step at a time. Life had thrown me a curveball, but I was still standing. Broken, yes, but not defeated. The road stretched out in front of me, an open book waiting to be written. I had plans, vague ideas about what I wanted to do, places I wanted to see. But more than that, I wanted to find myself again. The man I was before all the hurt and betrayal. As the miles rolled by, I felt something stir inside me, a flicker of hope, a spark. It was going to be a long journey, but I was ready for it, ready to face whatever came my way, ready to build a new life, a life where I was the author of my own story. And so, with the sun setting in my rearview mirror, I drove towards the horizon.